Imagine standing on the coast of South Africa in the 1600s. You see ships in the distance, their sails catching the wind, and people arriving from faraway lands. Hi, my name's Amber, and today I'll be talking about how colonization transformed South Africa's land, people, along with its identity. So you're probably wondering, who were the people who were there first? These people were known as the Sand People, or the Bushmen, which is now considered a derogatory term. This was a name given by the European colonists. It comes from the Dutch word bosjesmans, meaning people of the bush, referring to the wilderness they lived in. There were also people called Khoikhoi. They were pastoralists, meaning that they herded cattle, sheep, and goats, unlike the Sand People, who were hunters and gatherers. According to South African History Online, the Sand are the best model we have for the hunter-gatherer lifestyle that saw so many generations through the Stone Age. What it suggests is that the Sand weren't just history. They embody a long, continuous way of life, rooted deeply in our shared human story through their knowledge of the land, of seasons, of survival, speaks not only to their own history, but to the broader human journey. Another quote from South African history says, "Rock art by the late Stone Age hunter-gatherers can be found in the form of paintings or engravings in almost every district in South Africa." What this shows us is that the Sand People weren't just any ordinary people. Their presence and creativity shines through all their beautiful artwork all around their landscape. Their rock paintings aren't just decorations. They're messages, memories, expression of spirituality, and of community. So you're probably wondering, who colonized them? In 1652, Jan van Riebeeck and the Dutch East Indian Company arrived in South Africa, not to take over land, but just to make a stop for ships heading to Asia. But things changed very quickly. The colonization of South Africa states, "It was seemingly the intention of the VOC to only establish a halfway station at the Cape." Van Riebeeck soon realized that the land had immense possibilities, and only a year after they had landed in the Cape, he released 9 company servants to start full-time farming. As a result, the Dutch started farming, took land from the Khoikhoi, and brought in enslaved workers. So why did the Dutch suddenly go from a simple pit stop to a full-on farming settlement? Well, it all comes down to survival, profit, and more opportunities. Those passing ships needed food, fresh water, and supplies, and the Dutch were going to do whatever it took just to get that, even at the cost of taking land from the Khoikhoi and using enslaved workers. The impact of colonialism says, from Batavia, the Dutch borrowed slavery and the display of wealth. This resulted in almost every wealthy person having slaves or servants. This was a major benefit to colonializers. This was because it gave them cheap labor to farm the land, make profits, and grow settlements, all while controlling an important stop on the trade route to Asia. So how did the colonial era end? By the early 1900s, the Dutch and the British had been in South Africa for hundreds of years. Eventually, their official rule ended, and South Africa became a country led by white leaders. But even though the Europeans were gone, the systems they set up, who owned the land, who had power, and who controlled money, stayed in place. According to the Anti-Apartheid Legacy Project, the roots of apartheid can be found in Dutch and British colonialism. While the Dutch and British were colonial rivals, the laws and customs they enacted were all based around the exploitation of the indigenous African population. This effectively laid the groundwork for apartheid in the mid-20th century. So you're probably wondering, what is apartheid? Apartheid was a set of laws that separated people by their race. White South Africans got most power, while Black, Indian, and colored South Africans had very few rights. The Anti-Apartheid Legacy Project also says that all of these laws were designed to maintain white power in South Africa. It affected almost every aspect of an individual's life, determining where they could live and work, their access to education, who they could socialize with, and what they could buy. So that raises a big question. What were the long-term consequences of colonialization in South Africa? How did the centuries of foreign rule and racial division shape the country we see today? The long-term consequences in South Africa are still felt today. When the Dutch and British took control, they built systems that gave white settlers most of the land, wealth, and political power, while pushing Black South Africans to the edges of society. Even after colonialization officially ended, those systems didn't just disappear. Apartheid still continued the same inequality. And when it finally ended in 1994, South Africa was left with deep economic and social divides. According to the Democracy of Africa, this possession created a large pool of cheap labor for white-owned farms and industries. Without access to land for subsistence or commercial farming, Black South Africans had little to no choice but to work for low wages in the capitalist economy. This shows how colonization created long-lasting poverty and inequality. Another study from Silo, South Africa, explains that colonial apartheid is the cause of a vast inequality in South African society, including social institutionalized poverty amongst the blacks in South Africa. This proves that racial and economic division are still part of South Africa's reality today. Many black South Africans still struggle with poverty, unemployment, and limited access to land, problems that began under colonial rule. Culturally, colonization also erased and replaced many local traditions and languages with European ones. So in other words, colonization didn't just change South Africa's history, it shaped its present. The effects are still visible on who has power, who has land, and who still fights to be heard. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.